I'd like to thank Paul for the care with which he went through his notes about my professional type. But that person isn't here tonight, Paul. He couldn't be here anyway, unless the person who is here tonight were here. The person who is here tonight is not very different from any other member in this room, and would like to begin in the usual way of a speaker to an AA group. My name is Marty, and I am an alcoholic. Thanks. Now I can go on. I'd like to make awfully clear that it is because I am an alcoholic that all of the other things you heard came about. Of course, they couldn't have come about if I had remained an active alcoholic. And they might not have come about if I had recovered by any other means than AA. But sometimes I've described myself, when I have been introduced by my everyday, workaday title, as a schizophrenic. For I am indeed two people. One of them is Marty, the alcoholic, who by the grace of God found AA and recovered. The other is Mrs. Mann, who wants the whole world to understand alcoholism, who wants to take the stigma which nearly killed Marty off of alcoholism, who wants to have it recognized for what it is, a disease like any other, not a shame or a disgrace or anything which need be hidden, but something which, thank God, can be treated successfully and from which people can return not only to normal lives, but sometimes perhaps to more productive lives than they would have had otherwise. I think alcoholism brings this about more than any other disease I can think of, partly because it takes so many years out of our lives, we who have had it. And when they are restored to us and we look back over that wasteland, which may have been 2 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years of time lost, we set about very frequently with what seems like 10 times normal energy to make up for that lost time. I know that's what happened to me. And I think before I go any further that I ought to identify myself for those who do not know me and who do not know my story, so that there is no doubt in anyone's mind that I have earned the right to stand here. I paid my initiation fee. Furthermore, I earned it the hard way, and I was not what we in the East, at least, call a high-bottom drunk. I was a low-bottom drunk. There was a period around New York when those of us who were low-bottom drunks were apparently waving the flag so hard, thinking that nobody else had a right to belong, that quite a delegation of high-bottom drunks told us off and announced they had as much right to join as we did, and that it could hurt just as much to be a high-bottom drunk as to be a low-bottom drunk. Well, I'm not going to go over a blow-by-blow account of my drinking. I would merely like to say that in many ways it followed a usual pattern. Scientific studies, for instance, have shown that it's about 10 years of drinking before the signs of alcoholism become visible on the outside. They've also indicated that in most cases the signs are visible to the person who has the alcoholism right from the start, if they only knew what they were. Most of us don't. I hope in the future these signs will be so well known to everyone that alcoholics may come for help before they have suffered at all. For I don't like to look at a world which has the kind of suffering in it that we have all known, to the extent that it has. And I would like to see alcoholics able to recover before they have damaged themselves and so many other people. Anyway, I began drinking, as most Americans do, in my late teens. And to all intents and purposes, it seemed I drank just like everyone else. I grew up in Prohibition. Everyone, at least in my city and in my circles, drank. And as soon as I discovered alcohol, I took to it like a duck to water. As far as I could see, I drank not differently, just a little bit better than anyone else. And that was true, I did. But I think it's worth repeating that there were three things that happened almost at once, which had I known then, I would have known that I was one of those people who should never drink. But I didn't know that. Neither did anyone around me. The world didn't know those things then. This was the first. Like most kids of that age, I was shy. Growing up is a painful process, you know. And I discovered immediately that a drink, or two or three, dissolved that shyness. Made things a whole lot easier. Well, that's not an original discovery. Everyone that's ever had a drink knows that. That is not the symptom I am referring to. What I am referring to is the fact that I couldn't wait to have my drink with the others. I couldn't stand even 10 minutes of unrelieved shyness when I went out on a date or was on my way to a party. I couldn't wait for the drinks to be served. Right away, at the very beginning, I went to my father's cupboard and had several drinks before I went out on my date. 17 years old. Never occurred to me there was anything odd about it. I just thought it was a sign of super intelligence. I assumed that anybody who had any brains would think that one up. And it didn't occur to me that everyone else didn't do the same thing because I never compared any notes. I took it for granted that only the dumb ones didn't. The second thing was the fact that I discovered immediately that one drink didn't do me one bit of good. Might as well have had water or Coca-Cola. Two drinks, well, I began to be aware of the fact that I'd had them, but it took three, good ones too, before I got the reaction that I needed, my release from shyness, my inner comfort, the things I was looking for from that drink. And so it was always at least three that I had before I started out. That makes two. The third thing that became evident immediately was my remarkable capacity. I could outdrink everyone. I quickly acquired the nickname of Hollow Leg. The boys that took me out boasted about it, even though it was very expensive for them. During Prohibition, this was something to be proud of. and they were intensely proud of me. I could drink more than anybody, and not show it. This was the real point. I never got thick feet, I never got rubber legs, I never fell down. I was always the one that could be trusted to drive the car, carefully and well, we all thought. I didn't have any accidents anyway, so I guess I did pretty well. I was always the one that remembered everything that happened. In fact, I was a perfect drinker. You know, it didn't occur to me until a good many years after I had come into AA that if I so quickly gained the reputation of being able to drink more than anybody else, that I must have always been drinking more than anybody else. It was a long time before I could look back with the objectivity of years of sobriety and the knowledge gained through my active membership in AA and my friendship with hundreds and later thousands of other AAs, that these things were actually symptoms of incipient alcoholism that showed the very minute I took a drink. My early days in AA, I used to get up and start my talk by saying, well, for the first 10 years I was a social drinker. Now, I said that because I didn't get into any serious trouble. I didn't begin to have any hangovers until after the first 10 years. At least they were so mild they didn't count. I never had a blackout in those first 10 years. I never misbehaved publicly in any way at all. Never passed out, never fell down, never made a fool of myself. And so I assumed I'd been a social drinker. But as time went on and I learned more about this problem of alcoholism, I realized that those 3 signs that I have told you about, my inability to wait 1 minute for what alcohol could do for me, and immediately and ingeniously finding a way to cut that waiting time to nothing, my dependence on alcohol to do for me what all of my contemporaries were having to learn to do for themselves, which is quite simply growing up. You see, I stopped growing up right then and there. I let alcohol do it. The needle got stuck in the groove, emotionally speaking at least, age 17. And not until I stopped drinking, 17 years later, did that needle begin to move along the groove. I was still 17 years old emotionally. This, to me, is the explanation of what the psychiatrists mean when they say we are emotionally immature. It merely means that at the moment when we begin to depend upon alcohol to do all the difficult things for us, we stop growing in those areas. We must. Because growth means the exercise of all the things in you that need to grow. Your mind and your emotions, particularly your emotions. They have to be exercised properly. They have to learn discipline. They have to learn how to manage themselves, or you have to learn how to manage them. And you don't learn any of those things if you don't practice. And how can you practice if you're letting alcohol do it? The muscles are all flabby. They have never had any exercise. Well, I believe this is what happened to me. This didn't stop intellectual growth. I went right on reading and learning a great deal and meeting lots of people and going places and picking up all kinds of things. But emotionally, I think there was a stoppage right there. And of course, today, with what we are beginning to learn about alcoholism, it looks as if I'd had an abnormal physical reaction right from the start. It is not physically normal to be able to consume the amounts of alcohol that I could at that age and show no signs whatsoever. That isn't normal. It's not a normal reaction to alcohol. And I know now that I never had a normal reaction to alcohol. All the same, these things went unnoticed, unrecognized by me. And as far as I knew, I didn't begin to show any signs until I was 27. And then during the course of 1 year, a number of things happened. Blackouts were the first. And the first time I had one, I thought it was the result of a concussion. I had had a concussion. I had had a fall and hurt myself rather badly. I was not drunk at the time I had it, incidentally. And I expected that they would go away. But instead of that, they continued. They became longer in duration, more severe, and more frequent. Also, I developed the true alcoholic hangover. And you know, sometimes I wonder about these people who talk about hangovers. I have a lot of non-alcoholic friends. What they describe isn't what I remember. I don't think non-alcoholics know the meaning of the word hangover. I think they ought to get another word for what's wrong with them. I developed the kind of hangover we know. The kind where you can't lift your head from the pillow. Where the only thing that will enable you to keep your hands on the ends of your wrists is several drinks. On the other hand, your stomach won't keep them. You're in a hell of a fix. This is what I mean by a hangover. And I developed that kind of a hangover. And this meant that I no longer could begin to function in the morning without a good dose of alcohol. It was my medicine. It was essential. If I was going to put myself together, if I was going to stop taking, if I was going to be able to brush my teeth and fix my face and comb my hair and make any kind of an appearance, it was essential that I have upward of a pint of liquor. All of this in 1 year. And of course, by this time, my blackouts were almost continuous. Naturally, my friends began talking to me about it, suggesting that why didn't I drink like I used to? Why didn't I just have a few? Why didn't I drink like this one or that one? And this is precisely what I wanted to know myself. What had happened? I couldn't figure it out. You see, I had always been a person of an unusually strong will, which is the nice way of putting it. Some people call it headstrong. Some people call it willful. Some people call it determined to have your own way. Whatever it was, I had it. If I wanted something, I got it. If I wanted to do something, I did it. Now, I wanted to drink like everybody else, the way I used to. I couldn't. This was the greatest shock I had ever had. It shook me to my roots. I couldn't understand it. I kept trying it again. And then I kept trying to find the explanation to myself of why my own decisions made only to me didn't work. Remember, this was new. If I had made a decision, I want to do so-and-so, or I want such and such, might have taken some time, but I always got there. But in this case, I made these decisions. I'm only going to have 2 or 3 Saturday nights. That's a party I've been looking forward to for months. I'm going to enjoy myself. So come Saturday night, I remember starting out for the party, and the next thing I know, it's the next day, and I find out that I spent the evening under the coats in the living room, while everybody else enjoyed the party. Or perhaps I wasn't under the coats laid out. Perhaps I was walking and talking and mixing with everybody. The only thing was I couldn't remember a thing about it. I had drawn a blank before I even got there. Now, I don't consider that this is much fun. And it also frightened me nearly to death. I didn't know what I might have done, said, where I might have been. I had to try and find out from other people without admitting that I couldn't remember. I had to explain this to myself. And I went through all the usual explanations. You know, we in AA, after we're sober, talk about these things as rationalization, excuses. I'm going to throw a great big question into that. I believe that what people think of as excuses and rationalizations are, in a great many cases at least, the honest effort of the alcoholic to explain to himself or herself the unexplainable. I desperately wanted to know what was happening to me, what had gone wrong, where, why. So I explored. Now, what had I done that day? Had I eaten enough? I'd been working terribly hard. I had my own business, and there are no hours in your own business. I'd been up to all hours, 2 or 3 nights running. I had been emotionally upset, sometimes about business, sometimes about other things. So-and-so had said such and such, or done such and such. I explored and looked for every conceivable reason that would explain to me, not to anybody else, just to me, what was happening to me. Why was this happening? Why, when I had made up my mind to myself that I wasn't going to allow it to happen anymore, what had happened to my willpower? Where had it gone? Why couldn't I follow my own decision? And I explored further and further, and every door that I tried to open slammed in my face. Because none of these reasons that I was trying seemed to really explain what was happening. And so my inner terror grew deeper and deeper. And I became more and more convinced of what seemed to me the only logical answer to behavior like mine. I was insane. Something had cracked in my mind during that year when the change had taken place. You see, not knowing one thing about alcoholism, never having heard the word alcoholism, I didn't realize, I couldn't realize, that what had happened in that 10th year was merely the progressive culmination of a whole string of signs that had begun when I first took a drink. I didn't know that. To me, this was something sudden. One year I was able to drink better than anybody else, and the next year I was falling down drunk all the time, or walking around in a blackout. One year everybody wanted me around because I was such a good drinker and I was great fun when I drank, and the next year nobody wanted any part of me because I was a nuisance. They didn't know what to do with the body. Well, it was very important to me to figure out how this had happened, why this sudden change, and there were no answers. This was the mid-1930s. There were no answers. There weren't any books to read. There weren't any doctors that knew. I went to a lot of them. Nobody used the word alcoholism. Nobody knew what an alcoholic was. And I'm talking actually about very intelligent circles in many different parts of the world. When it got so bad with me, I happened to be living abroad. I knew a great many people, and a lot of them were very important people, and many of them were considered the most intelligent people in the world, but they didn't know anything about alcoholism. They didn't know the word any more than I did. So the word that got attached to me right away was drunkard. When anyone used that to me, to my face, I reacted in what I think is a perfectly normal way for anyone that knew the little that I knew about this whole subject. Drunkard to me meant just one thing: a Skid Row bum. Now, I am using that phrase in quotes, Skid Row bum. It's all one word to the people that use it. And they mean it as a term of opprobrium, contempt. And they also mean it as a label of hopelessness. I'd never given much thought in my life, which had been a life of privilege, a life of many opportunities, a life of wide travel, a life of very wide acquaintance. I had never given much thought to these people who were down and out, who lived in the less savory parts of our city. But if I had, I'd have thought in one of two ways. Either they were poor unfortunates who had been born in the slums and never had the guts to get out, or if they had ever been born to something better, there was something wrong with them, and they had sunk to their proper level. Water finds its own level, you know. This is about the sum total of what was in my mind about drunkards. It wasn't a nice word, and it meant only that. Naturally, when somebody called me that, it was a fighting word. I don't know that the people that pulled it on me meant it that way. I think perhaps they were using it for shock value, hoping I would, quote, come to my senses, unquote, what everybody expects us to do. Just as if they would expect someone in the last stages of TB to come to their senses and stop coughing. Well, it makes just as much sense. Same idea. Anyway, I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't stand for it. And so whenever anybody said that word to me or spoke to me about my drinking or asked me the questions that I'd been asking myself for months, and which, since I couldn't answer myself, I certainly couldn't answer then, I just moved on. I was living in London. I was in the kind of business that brought me in contact with a great many different groups of people, and so it was easy for me to move from one group to another. But in the course of this same year, I'd gone through London like a dose of salt. I'd been in all the groups. The same thing had happened every time. And finally, I started the geographical cure. I got out of London. By this time, I was very badly hooked. I was unable to live without alcohol, and I was unable to live with it. At least to live with myself with it. I loathed myself. I hated what I was. I hated the way I looked. I hated what I did. I didn't want to be like that. All of the doctors I had seen, and there were quite a number by then, had told me I wasn't insane. Oh, they told me I had an anxiety neurosis and several other kinds of neurosis, and I'd had a nervous breakdown, and a lot of things that didn't satisfy me, because I knew that there was something terribly serious that was wrong. This I knew in my heart. Besides, I was in a foreign country. And I was fearful by this time of going to any more doctors for fear that one of them would clap me into an institution and I'd never get out. After all, I was an alien. And so I began working as hard as I could to get home, and since, like most alcoholics, we are very ingenious people, you know. And also, like most alcoholics, there were always one or two people that were still trying to help. Curious thing about an alcoholic, they always have a friend, or two, or three. People who are still trying to help us. People who still believe that someday we'll be all right. People who still believe in us. People who frequently, in their ignorance, say wrong things to us, make wrong moves, do wrong things. And we retaliate out of our deep hurt and our deep fear. We retaliate badly. We kick them in the teeth. We curse them for interfering. But actually, deep in our hearts, we're grateful. And after we're sober, every one of us can look back and think of people that tried to help us, to whom we owe something. And it's one more reason to be grateful that we are here, that we are sober, that we are able to remember that. I had such a friend, a girl much younger than I, who had worked for me for a while when I was still able to work, who was terribly concerned and wanted very much to see that I got help, wanted to see that I got home. The last year that I was working in London, she used to make the rounds of the pubs to find out where I was and see that I got home safely very often. And this girl took me all the way to Southampton and poured me on the boat. I doubt if I'd ever have made it otherwise. I was very fond of her. Years later, after I came into AA, I met a relative of hers who was interested in us, who gave us a farm in Connecticut, which we still use, called High Watch Farm. And I had been going up there for a year and a half before I found that its owner and benefactress, Sister Frances, we called her, was the aunt of my friend in London, my friend Mimi. And so I learned about Mimi and what had happened to her, because when I finally came back to America, I lost all contact with my friends abroad for a long while and wasn't able to renew it because I couldn't find some of them. And I found that things had been happening to Mimi. Kind of suspected from what I heard things weren't too good. Time went on, I heard more rarely. And just this last winter, Mimi, who is much younger than I, died of alcoholism. And there was someone who had tried to help me, and whom I was never able to help. And the gratitude I feel toward Mimi and what she did for me will have now to be expressed to many other people, expressed to others who are still suffering. And I'll have to try to help them for Mimi's sake. But all of us have people like that along the way. We are very fortunate, we alcoholics. I think many of us wouldn't have survived without these friends, these people who can see what we really are in spite of what we seem to be, can tell that we actually are human souls in desperate trouble, often in terrible fear, can see through to that and help us, or try to, in spite of ourselves, in spite of that wall of defiance we put up against the world, that wall of defiance against their lack of understanding, against their inability to know what's going on inside of us. But we, too, are crying out for an answer. Why are we different? Why has this happened to us? What have we done that this should happen to us? And what is it? What kind of madness is this? What kind of insanity is this that grips me? I don't believe there's an alcoholic, however defiant on the surface, however full of false gaiety, however irresponsible seeming, that doesn't cry out in that way in the dead of night or in those horrible hours from 3 to 5 a.m. when so many of us who are still drinking are lying quaking on a bed. We've drunk up everything in the house, and there isn't anywhere in the city where we can get any more. And we have to stay there with ourselves alone. This is a loneliness beyond anything that any other group of people ever knows. This is a loneliness that is so miserable, so agonized, so fearful, so deep. Only another alcoholic can understand it, because they too have felt it. And it is out of this depth that we come when we recover from our alcoholism. This is what is behind. This is what is underneath us. This is what is in our hearts and our minds and our memories. And it is this so often that drives us to do more and more for other alcoholics, that keeps us going in this work, that makes us work so hard at it. It is this memory, this realization of the true depths of the suffering that an alcoholic goes through. I sought help when I got back. I didn't find it right away. I spent a miserable year in New York City, and by this time my blackouts sometimes lasted for many days at a time. I'd lose a week or more and not know where I'd been or what I'd done. I never drew a sober breath. Yes, I was a low-bottom drunk. I often think of that year. I remember days when physically I could take no more alcohol. And so I had to lie on the bed and shake, sweat, and have the horrors because my body wouldn't entertain enough alcohol to get me out of that state. And this sometimes lasted for days, taking it out of necessity. Unable to get off the bed, to go and order liquor. Unable to talk, unable to sleep, unable to eat. Unable to live, really. Except there seemed no choice. It wasn't quite bad enough to die. It was too bad to go on. And sometimes when I'm walking the streets of New York today and I look up at those tall apartment buildings, I wonder, behind how many windows is someone lying on a bed the way I did that last year of my drinking, suffering as I suffered, and perhaps knowing as little as I knew about what was wrong. Well, I found a doctor who gave me a chance, and I spent months in a hospital, and I still felt I needed more help. And then I was sent to a private sanitarium, which was what I wanted. And I got what I was seeking, which was psychiatric treatment. Every day. I had a wonderful doctor. There was only one thing wrong with it. He told me I could never drink again. He was the only doctor in that sanitarium that said that. So I figured I had the wrong doctor. He couldn't give me an adequate explanation. He just said I was the kind of person who couldn't drink, but I didn't see why. The psychiatric view back then in 1938 was that this was merely a symptom of an underlying disorder. Now, I was getting treatment for my underlying disorders, every one of them, daily for an hour, every day. And this went on for well over a year. And I was gaining a great deal from that treatment. I want it clearly understood that I do not feel I was cheated, that I do not feel that this was of no benefit, that I feel instead that possibly I was made ready to accept AA when it finally came. And after I had accepted it, what I learned in those treatment sessions with that doctor made me far better able to apply it and to use it well. No, I am grateful. And I learned a great deal. But the prevailing theory of this little symptom I had stuck in my mind. You see, nobody used the word alcoholism then. Nobody spoke of it as a disease in itself. No, your drinking was just a symptom. Now, this is very upsetting to an alcoholic. I now know, I didn't then. It was a very nice, pleasant theory, because it meant that sooner or later we'd get these underlying things straightened out, and then I'd be able to drink the way I could when I began drinking. I'd be Miss Hollowlegs again. I'd outdrink everybody and have a wonderful time and never suffer. This is simple logic. One thing that they don't realize, people who still hold that theory, and unfortunately there are a lot who do, is that I don't think there's an alcoholic living who'd be satisfied with one or two drinks. What good is that? It certainly would never have satisfied me. Returning to normal drinking for me meant drinking the way I used to drink, which was all I could lay my hands on every time I could. What I wanted was to be able to do that and not pay any price, as I had been able to do in my youth. Well, I kept trying every time I got a chance. And so, of course, I got drunk whenever I tried. Then the doctor and I would worry over it and try to figure out why it had happened. He was just about through with me, ready to turn me loose as another hopeless case, when he was given a book to read, asked to comment on it. It was a manuscript. And he read it, and he was deeply impressed. And he said to me, "I think I have something here that will help you." And he handed me this manuscript bound in red cardboard covers. And the title of it was Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I began to read it. And here for the first time I saw a description of what was wrong with me. And I found it had a name, and the name was alcoholism. And I was very happy indeed. I was never one of those that boggled at that word. Never one of those that didn't want that label pinned on me. I was tickled to death there was a label. I had been convinced I had some nameless insanity that was too awful to put a name to. The only trouble about this book was it talked a great deal about God. And I wanted no part of God. You see, I was an intellectual. Intellectuals stand on their own feet. They run their own lives. They are not dependent on anything or anyone. The fact that I'd been dependent on alcohol for a good many years didn't occur to me. No, I was independent and I had to find my own way out by myself. Have you ever heard that before? And this wasn't it. But I went on reading, because the doctor made me, and I went on complaining about what I found in the book and how it wasn't for me. Now, at that point, it seemed to me sheer accident that this book had come into my doctor's hands. seems sheer accident that I should have been there at that time and been given this book to read out of all the people in the world who might have been given it to read. I don't think that anymore. And I don't think that what follows was an accident. Somewhere in that book, and I can't quote the page, it talks about how most of us who are alcoholics need a crisis. A crisis that will, in effect, bring us to our knees and make us turn to the only place where help is, to God. And the book suggests, and I'm not quoting exactly, that conceivably we who go to call on people that may become members can produce that crisis by telling them the exact nature of alcoholism. Well, you see, that crisis didn't work for me because alcoholism was better than what I thought I had. So I had not been brought to my knees. But God took care of that. Another crisis came about. A crisis in my family, for which I felt responsible because I was where I was in that institution. And I was helpless to do anything about it. Utterly and completely helpless. Just like the book says you have to be with your crisis or it isn't a real crisis. And in this situation I became very angry. And I had the usual alcoholic reaction. We who are so intelligent, so intellectual, and so smart. Being angry at somebody else or at the world, I wanted to pick up a hammer and bash my own head in. We always do. We have a way of describing it. An alcoholic plus a resentment equals a drunk. Now, who does the drunk hurt? Me. But I wanted to go and get a couple of bottles and get drunk and show them. And I would have hurt no one but myself. At that moment, the book was lying on my bed open, and I wasn't really looking at it. But out of the corner of my eye, the page was there, I guess. It was blurred. And in the middle of that page, it seemed to me suddenly, there was a sentence that stood up as if in sharp block letters. Very clear. The sentence read, "We cannot live with anger." And this was the sentence that did it to me. It was the battering ram that broke down all my defenses, that broke down all my resistance to belief, to faith, to God. And the next thing I knew, I was on my knees beside the bed. The bedspread was wet. And when I lifted my head, I had a sense of freedom such as it is impossible to describe. Many people in the history of the world have felt the presence of God. Many people have had spiritual experience. Very few of them describe it the same. I think it is because it is indescribable. I don't think there are words to describe what happens at a moment like that. The only words I have are the word freedom. I was so free that I knew I could walk out of that third-story window and keep right on walking. Nothing could hold me. Nothing could imprison me. Nothing could frighten me. And after a few minutes of realization of this feeling, which is the most wonderful feeling I have ever had, a little thought came in from my everyday mind, and it said, "How you are crazy." Who can walk out of a third-story window and not fall? But you know you can, and I did know I could. So I went downstairs to see the doctor. And when he saw me, he called me straight in. He said, "Tell me what happened." And I told him. in as much detail as he wanted, and he asked a million questions. And when I was through, he said, "No, I don't think you're crazy. I believe you have had an authentic spiritual experience, and you needn't be afraid of it. Many people have had them. There's a whole book about it called Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. Get it, read it. Now go back and read that book." And I went back to read the book. And I began at the beginning, and it seemed to me it was a totally different book. I chopped it up like a sponge. I read it not once, but several times. I knew whole chunks of it by heart. But I was fearful of meeting the people. Still fearful, as I had always been, of meeting strangers. And so it was several weeks before the doctor once again put the pressure on and got me into New York and sent me to a meeting. And there, for the first time, I met AA. When I went in, I was as frightened as I always had been. I had no drink to bolster my courage. But as soon as they spoke to me, I wasn't frightened anymore. It was a curious thing. I spoke easily and honestly to them. I had no difficulty talking to them. I didn't feel shy. I didn't feel separate. I didn't feel on the outside looking in. I didn't feel as if I was walled off. I belonged, and I knew it. This was my first taste of the fellowship that is AA. For many years, that seemed enough. The fellowship, the meetings, sponsoring new people, working with new people, going places and doing things with other AAs, being a part of a group. This was it. Well, it was it, in a way. It protected me against drinking. It gave me time to regain my feet, to get a solid sobriety under me, to clear my mind, and to clear my soul. And then gradually I came to see that I had been busy with the technique of AA. Oh yes, I knew the steps. I read the steps nearly every day. I tried to practice them as best I could. But I was awfully busy with the technique. Gradually it came home to me that what I had to do something about if I was going to be a good AA wasn't meetings or groups or people who were still drinking or my sponsors or people I'd sponsored. It was me. Suddenly I read those steps, and you know how they change as you grow. And I saw very clearly that the word alcohol was only mentioned once. Here I'd been thinking all along that I had come into Alcoholics Anonymous entirely and solely because of my drinking. That the whole purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous was to do something about my drinking and other people's drinking. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that the steps didn't have a thing in the world to do with drinking. The first one did, and that indicates that until you did something about your drinking, you couldn't do much about the other 11 steps. Certainly an active alcoholic couldn't follow any of those steps. You had to get the drinking out of the way, and that's what the techniques were all about. And once you got the drinking out of the way, you could really begin to do something about the steps, which had to do with you, with me. And I realized that these were tools with which I could examine myself, with which I could take myself apart. That moral inventory, for instance. It hasn't to do with morals. It has to do with what you are made up of. What in you are the good things and what are the bad? And we all have some of each. How do they balance? Do the bad overweigh the good? Or do the good overweigh the bad? And if you put them down honestly, especially with someone else's help, most of you will find, I think everyone would find, the good outweighs the bad, actually. The only trouble is that we have been keeping the emphasis so completely and so continually on the bad. We have become such experts at putting our worst foot forward on every occasion that practically everybody thinks that's us. They don't see the good things. We don't give them a chance to. But that if we wish, we can shift that emphasis. It's just like taking a great big searchlight and turning it around. And if you keep the light on the good ones, they become more visible to other people too. And if you keep the emphasis on the good things in you, you will begin automatically to put your best foot forward. People will begin to like you. And I began to think back at the kind of person I had wanted to be when I was growing up. And I don't mean materially, like a great success or a millionaire or a fine artist or a great writer or a policeman or a fireman or what have you, or the mother of 10. All of these are things that kids think about when they're that age and think they want to be. No, I mean the deep things I wanted to be. And I realized that I shared them, I think, with every other human being on the face of the globe. Just what I wanted most was to be a good, decent person, liked by other people, someone people wanted to have around, someone who was needed, someone who belonged, who was a part of the human race. And through my alcoholism, not through my choice, I had been cut off from the human race. I had, in effect, resigned from the human race when it didn't understand me. And believe me, it didn't. It still doesn't understand most of it. And it isn't so surprising that we resign and go off to nurse our wounds. We have plenty of wounds. We suffer. Alcoholism is a very painful disease for the person who has it as well as for everybody else. So I had been cut off from some of the basic things I wanted from life. I wanted to get along with people. I wanted to be liked. I wanted the approval of my own kind. Who doesn't? But if you're going to get those things, you have to be a good, decent, kind person. You have to be someone whom others can get along with. You have to be willing to let them have their ideas. You can't push them around any more than you want them to push you around. You have to learn to take your place in humanity as a human being. And I think a human being is a very fine thing. For I think he is made in the image of God. And all he has to do is accept that image. But that isn't easy for people like us. And so we have to work at it. And the 12 steps are the tools we have been given with which we can work. One of the things I look back and can tell bothered me most was my feeling of separation. It was complete, that feeling. I was separated from everything. And being separated from humankind, from those around me, I was, of course, naturally separated from God. I was utterly and completely separated. AA offered me my first bridge back. Here I found I was no longer separated from other people like myself. And little by little, as time went on, I began to realize that I could feel not separated from others who were not necessarily like myself. And gradually I realized I no longer felt separated from God. It's interesting that experience I described to you didn't give me all this. It gave me a relief. It enabled me to go forward and learn these other things. It merely released me from a block that had kept me separate. It got me out of my prison of self, my prison of the box, what I used to call the glass cage in which I lived, the glass box. But after that, I had to find my own way. I had to find my own way back. I had to find out what people were really like, and I found them good. I had to be able to give without thought of getting. I had to learn the meaning of love. I think I had never known it. Certainly I had spent a lifetime until my mid-30s measuring out the love I gave in an eyedropper, terrified I might give more than was being given me, suspicious, fearful, standoffish. And I learned as I grew in AA that you have to be able to give love with no thought of return at all. And it is the giving of love that makes you feel wonderful, not the getting of it. Not that that isn't pleasant, but the thing that really makes you feel good is to be able to give it. And here in AA is where I learned that lesson. And here is where I learned to love people. And I learned, for instance, that you can love people even though you may not like them very much. I found there were many that I was trying to help, whose characters and peculiarities irritated the life out of me. And all too often I would discover that the thing that irritated me most in them was also in me. It was a fault of my own that I saw as in a mirror. No wonder it irritated me. And so I found that by helping the people that bothered me the most, I learned the most about myself. And I discovered that I was embarked upon a voyage of self-discovery, a voyage that has no end. Because we who are human beings are much more than most of us think. Here in AA we see glimpses of it. We see fellow members who transcend themselves, who at moments become great, fine, wonderful, almost divine. They show love surpassing ordinary love. They show kindness and forgiveness surpassing what we have come to expect from people. They show patience and tolerance and understanding and empathy, an ability to put themselves in the other guy's shoes and to know how he feels. These things you find here, not all together in one person, not all the time in anyone. But here we can find glimpses of these things. We are embarked upon a great adventure in AA. AA is so much more than just a treatment for alcoholism. That it is too. But the reason, to my mind, that it has had so much more success than all the other treatments put together, and there are other ways of recovering from alcoholism, and sometimes some people need those ways first before they can make it in AA. You know, if you've broken both legs, you need 2 crutches. And if you've broken both hips, you may need a wheelchair as well. You may need every prop and every kind of help available before you can make the grade. Because alcoholism is one of the most serious diseases that has ever been known. And it has reached different degrees in different people. AA offers, I think, the easiest, the pleasantest way out of alcoholism. But alcoholics are famous for always taking the hard way. And some of them may have to arrive at this by a much harder road than just simple AA. They'll get here in the end if we'll wait for them, if we'll keep our arms open, if we will be patient and understanding and realize that they are perhaps sicker than we were. Perhaps they have more than just alcoholism. Maybe those other things have to be tended to first before we can help. And that what we have to offer is not just a treatment for alcoholism, but a way of life for the rest of our lives. A pattern that will enable us to grow, to expand, to become bigger and better than we ever dreamed we could. A pattern that will remove any separation we may ever have felt from God as we understand it. A pattern that will either return us to our church or bring us to a new understanding of what God really is and how He works and moves through us. I think I saw God first in AA members. They showed me what God could be. They showed me forgiveness and patience and understanding and kindness and love. And these are attributes of God, surely. And sometimes I couldn't see beyond a human being whom I could touch and feel and hear. I couldn't lift my eyes above that. And at that time, this was what had to interpret God to me. This is where it came from. This was what I could reach out to and hold on to. We are exemplifying that. This is what AA is to me. I don't mean for a minute that it cannot help someone who is still in the middle of their alcoholism. It can, and it should, and it must. What I am trying to say is that the rewards of AA go far beyond sobriety. Sobriety is a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. It is all very well to have sobriety, but what are we going to do with it? How are we going to use it? This is what AA is about. We learn what to do with it here. We learn how to use it. We learn how to grow. We learn how to love God and therefore to love each other. And I feel very full of love tonight, and I am very grateful for having had this opportunity. Thank you.